thank you, Hillary, and thank you to all of you. A bookstore is my natural habitat, and I, as both Dan and Hillary have spoken about, the power of the word, the power of elevated thought, which we associate with books, and we associate with bookstores. Unfortunately, the power of elevated thought is not what we always associate with politics. And I think a lot of people who have had the greatest interest in more elevated thought and wisdom have in many ways disconnected from politics over the last few years. There's been a kind of chronic disengagement on the part of many people. Sometimes America's best and brightest people who are seeking the deepest wisdom in our lives have sometimes been those who, because of the toxicity of politics, thought they didn't want anything to do with it. But I think we all know we've paid a terrible price for allowing our politics to go so far away from who we are deeply as human beings. And I think that much of what has happened in the last 2 years has forced us, much as any crisis forces us in our own personal lives. I think this sense of crisis in our collective national life has made all of us think very deeply about what's going on here, about what our own relationship is to what has gone on. I do feel that the challenges, political challenges that are represented by much of what is going on, is like an opportunistic infection that could not have taken hold of us had our immune system been stronger. And that's what citizens have to be. We have to be the immune system of a society. Too many things went too far. This that we're experiencing now didn't come out of nowhere. There was accumulated dysfunction. There was accumulated injustice. There was accumulated undemocratic behavior. There were accumulated unjust policies. There were just so many layers of the things that all of us would know in our hearts, well, that's not right. That got to the point with enough of us just hoping somebody was handling it, or just looking in every 2 years or 4 years, and now we are where we are. Well, I've had a 35-year career working with crisis. And one of the things that any of us know, if we are dealing with elevated thought and wisdom in our lives, is that crisis demands, real personal crisis, demands more than just a tweaking of things on the external plane. We have to look deep. Just like I'm talking about now, we all have to look deep. What happened here? And who are we, that we as citizens, what happened? Really deeply what happened? And when you look deeply at what happened, both in our political system and in us, you realize, as a nation, as citizens, what all of us realize when we're dealing with personal crises, that to get out of this, I'm going to have to look at myself and change some things within ourselves, within myself. And those questions that we have to ask ourselves, they are moral questions, they are spiritual questions, they are psychological issues, they are emotional issues. And all that a nation is a group of people. So the same dynamics of retrieving your wisdom and closing the gap between who you know in your heart you should be and who you actually are, those deep questions that have to be addressed on the level of our personhood are exactly the kinds of questions that we have to be asking ourselves about our country. So a lot of the political dysfunction that we call the issues, what is your position on the issues? The issues are often just the symptoms. And so a political system that addresses the symptoms but doesn't address the cause of the disease is like something watering the leaves but not the roots. It's like the way we used to look at medicine decades ago. When we didn't cultivate health, we just hoped that a doctor could give us some external allopathic remedy to eradicate or suppress the symptoms. Those days are over. We have a much more holistic, integrative approach to health and to healing. Because we know that sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And so now we need a more integrative, holistic perspective on our politics. One in which we realize that we are the immune system and that we have to cultivate a healthy democracy. You can't just have your democracy blow up in certain ways and then do what we're doing now, which we need to do, which is just make sure the house stands. But we're going to have to go deeper than that, or the next assault will be much closer and possibly even worse than this one. And so, with my campaign, and if you elect me your president with my presidency, we're going to take a deeper look at what really went wrong here. Because only if we, the citizens of the United States, allow ourselves to no longer farm this stuff out. You can't farm out your thinking in a free society. And you can't farm out your conscience, and you can't farm out your wisdom. Especially when, as at a time like this, you're farming it out to people and forces who are more than glad to take it from you, but who may or may not, in fact, have your best interests at heart. So the changes that we have to make within ourselves, we can't go back to who we were. We have to not only change in order to navigate these times, but the change has to become permanent. Citizenship, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to show up for life, just like we show up for our personal lives. If you know that your child is ill, God forbid, or someone you love is on drugs, or something in your life is in trouble, you become noble and intelligent real quickly. Well, your democracy is in trouble. And we must become noble and intelligent really quickly. And what I've seen, not only in my life, but in my career of 35 years, is that sometimes it's when crisis strikes that people become their most noble. And people become their most intelligent. And it has given me a lot of faith in people. And I have a lot of faith in the American people. We're no different than anybody else. We're no better or worse. But we have dignity and we have decency. And sometimes we become distracted. And sometimes we're thinking about other things. But when real life strikes, when somebody in our family is sick, something's really going on, we get real. And I believe that we're living at a time when enough of us are ready to get real. So what I'd like to talk to you about tonight are some areas where I feel we need to get real, and which, if we do not get real about, will continue to suck the moral force from our country in such a way that no matter what we do on external issues, the deeper level of dis-ease will always continue to build and to accumulate layers of dysfunction that could prove very perilous for our democracy and possibly for our planet and for our world. The first has to do with our economic system, which I think we would all agree, particularly Dan was talking about being as Democrats, I think we would all agree that something is very wrong with the way we are functioning economically. But I think that we need to take a deep look at what exactly is wrong and just how deeply wrong it is. About 40 years ago, we know that our country adopted, mainly because there was billions of dollars put behind it as a theory of trickle-down economics. And when I was a child, if a major corporation functioned in a way where it was expected that the corporation would have an ethical responsibility to its workers, and an ethical responsibility to the community, an ethical responsibility to the environment. But around 40 years ago, this new theory of trickle-down economics, a man named Milton Friedman sort of hooked up with Ayn Rand, and they spawned this monstrosity of an economic theory. And it was the idea, as we all know, that what should organize our economy was the idea of unfettered market forces. Market forces that would not be fettered to any ethical responsibility, that all it would have is fiduciary responsibility to stockholders. All that mattered in the functioning of a corporation was to increase the bottom line short-term profit maximization for the company. And that would, yes, make stockholders much richer, but that would be really good, see, because then all that money would trickle down. And that would lift all boats. And of course we know it hasn't lifted all boats. It left millions and millions of people without a life raft. It created the biggest income inequality since 1929. It has created a situation where 40% of Americans struggle just to make basic food costs, rent costs, health costs, and transportation costs. And we want to remind ourselves this is the richest country in the world. It's like cognitive dissonance. Wait, we're the richest country in the world. And I know in my work, and I know many of you do work and are old enough to get, something has changed in the last 20 years. It did not used to be so much despair. There did not used to be so much chronic anxiety. Something has changed, and I've been at what I do for 35 years. And so many people have been pushed not only into chronic economic tension and anxiety. What am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do if one of my kids gets sick? I hate this job, but I'm there just for the health benefits. Or how am I going to send my kids to college? Or how am I going to pay these college loans? And once again, we're the richest country in the world. The idea that we don't have universal health care. We have been trained, you see, to expect so little. We've been trained to expect so little. We've been trained to ask so little. We've been trained to forget, wait a minute, this is America, and it's supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And this has happened just year after year. None of this has been accidental, ladies and gentlemen. This has been very specific policies. Very specific tax policies, very specific subsidies, very specific ways in which, over the last 40 years, the major material resources of our government have been systematically placed into the hands of a very few people, to the point where we're not functioning as a democracy anymore. Because the democracy of the people, by the people, for the people is the idea that the will of the people is what dictates what happens. Well, the will of the people is universal health care. The will of the people is that our planet be protected. The will of the people is universal background checks. The will of the people is that we outlaw bump stocks. The will of the people is that everybody get a fair shot. But our government does not now serve as a handmaiden and an advocate to the will of the people. Rather, because of the undue influence of money on our system, particularly since Citizens United, our government behaves more as an advocate for the short-term profit maximization of these major multinational corporate conglomerates than for us. The first in this administration, the first Secretary of State, was the ex-CEO of Exxon, an oil company. So the State Department, which is supposed to be about diplomacy and humanitarian efforts, is headed by an oil company executive. Just as the EPA, which is supposed to be about protecting the environment, is now headed by a former chemical company executive, but before that by the oil company executive. Even today, our Defense Department is being headed now by an ex-30-year executive at Boeing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a covert takeover. This is not a covert corporate takeover of the U.S. government. This is an overt corporate takeover of the U.S. government. Now, this is the problem that I have. You have one major political party that says, yeah, what of it? And that actually apparently believes this is the way to go, although there's nothing conservative about what I just described. It's actually this is not high-minded conservative principle. That is corporatism. There is a difference between corporatism and conservatism. The real problem is neither conservative nor liberal. It's that too many conservatives aren't even acting like conservatives right now.
Yeah.
This authoritarian corporatism is something very, very different. It is a force that is anti-democracy for no other reason than that democracy is inconvenient to its purposes. Because if what is important is short-term profits for oil companies and chemical companies, then your water, your health, the pesticides that we know harm a developing child's brain, hey, if the chemical company would make more money, that's what matters. And so we'll overturn the ban. So it's not the planet we're protecting. We're the oil company and the chemical company profits and the agribusiness profits and the big pharma profits and the health insurance company profits and the military industrial contractors profits, to the point where we're dying here. We're dying here. You can't operate that way and be a democracy. And in 1776, we repudiated aristocracy. An aristocracy is where a few people are entitled. A few people are entitled to the land, and a few people are entitled to the wealth, and a few people are entitled to the education, and then the majority of people are little more than serfs working for them. We repudiated that in 1776. And our democracy has been sustained by the fact that we continue these little mini revolutions. The American Revolution is an ongoing process. It's just like your health. It's just like your exercise in your body. You never get to say, done, I don't have to take care of my body anymore. You never get to say about your marriage, done, I don't have to take care of it anymore. You never get to say about your relationship to your children, done, I don't have to take care of it anymore. And the same with your democracy. We thought we could just consider it a fait accompli. It's cool. No, it's not cool. Because with your democracy, as with any other relationship, you stop taking care of it, there are forces that would bring it down. Now, one major political party, like I said, apparently it's what Franklin Roosevelt called economic royalists. Apparently, these people are the same people. It's really a reversion to an archetype, is what it is. But the problem I have with a lot of people in the Democratic Party is that they will look at all of the pain I'm talking about, and they will seek to address the pain, but they will not challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. And I'm here talking to you, the citizens of New Hampshire, not because I know things that other candidates don't know, but because I'm willing to name some things that some other candidates aren't going to name. And that is because I believe that we have to go there. When you want to heal, you have to look deep. You have to get real. You have to get authentic. You have to be honest with yourself. And what this country has to be is honest with ourselves. So I want to talk about 3 particular areas where it's not necessarily fun to look at them, but adults don't just go for the fun conversation. Now, a politics as spectator sport is where, nobody wants to upset you too much, except maybe to make you angry at the other party, as though it's only them. We really need to be more honest with ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to talk at 3 areas where, no, I do not believe democratic policies made these things happen, but where neither do I believe democratic policies passionately or vigorously or proactively addressed them. And if I'm president, we will. Number 1, there are millions of American children who live in chronic trauma. Millions of American children who go to schools every day where schools don't even meet minimum safety requirements, and in some cases, those schools don't even have functioning toilets. Millions of these children live in what are called America's domestic war zones, where the violence on their streets, in their families, in their communities, in their homes is so great that psychologists tell us that the PTSD of a returning veteran from Iraq and Afghanistan is no worse than the PTSD that is experienced by these children. And whereas for a returning veteran it's post-traumatic, with these children it's present traumatic, because it is triggered and re-triggered every single day. Now, we are the only country in the world, in the advanced world, that bases our education funding on property taxes. So if your educational funding is based on property taxes, that means a child living in a poor neighborhood is going to get a poor education. If a child in many of the classrooms of these schools that I'm talking about, the teachers do not have adequate school supplies to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Now, if one person neglects a child, it is considered unethical at best and criminal at worst. So what are we as a country? What is this if not collective child neglect? And yet these children aren't old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency, so what kind of attention are they getting from our political establishment? And they're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. And in a system such as ours today, where the government works mainly as a handmaiden to these corporate forces that fund it, how can these millions of American children possibly compete with the clout of the economic strength and power of these major multinational corporate conglomerates? Not only that, even though we have gotten to a point where we get that women are not men's property, we haven't really made it to the point, really evolved to the recognition that children are not our property either. Yes. And children are full-on citizens of the United States. Yes. Now, what our Declaration of Independence says is not only that all men are created equal, but that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted to secure those rights. So shouldn't our government be securing the right of those children to pursue their happiness? We have simply normalized their despair. We should consider this a national emergency, because this is a humanitarian crisis. I read Michelle Obama's book, which was great, and I loved it. But one of the things I found odd was that she talked in her book about the very admirable work she did for these children when she was First Lady. She did very admirable work in the East Wing, in her East Wing function. But I couldn't help but wonder, reading that book, why wasn't that an issue addressed in the West Wing? Why is children just something, oh, that, and how nice, you know, maybe we'll get to it. And I believe as a woman that it's one thing before we had a voice in the public sphere, but we do have a voice in the public sphere now. And I believe that it is part of the feminine consciousness in both men and women that needs to be much louder at this point, that the first thing you do, which any species does if it wishes to survive, is to take care of its young. Now, when our economic system was developed, they did not even know what we know now. Neurologists now know about what happens in the first 8 years of life. That's when there's all this neuroplasticity and the power of cognitive functioning and cognitive retention. It all happens in the first 8 years of life. Now, this economic system that I've been telling you about tonight, it has nothing to do with planning for long-term economic good in this country. It has nothing to do with planning long-term economic good. We already talked, it's been 40 years. It hasn't brought economic good, it's brought economic devastation to millions and millions of people. But not only does it not plan long-term good, it can't plan long-term good because it sucks from the present all the profit. I mean, what company can succeed that doesn't prepare new products? Our children are new products. I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it's not that we should not care about our economic good, because we should care about our economic good. I'll tell you how to have a vibrant economy 10 years from now is to take better care of your 10-year-olds today. Yeah. So we should have our entire economic thinking is this 200-year-old relic. It's a 200-year-old relic that we've all just accepted, and it's all about the means of production. And then it all becomes who controls the means of production. Should it be the capitalists or should it be the socialists? Should it be the government or should it be the private sector? Who controls the means of production? That is like some relic that just needs to fall away in the 21st century. Your economic vibrancy comes when you unleash the spirit of the American people. That's where our economic vibrancy comes. If you want to see the gold that we're not mining in this country, if you want to see the extraordinary potential for good, for vibrancy, for excitement, for sustainability, for creativity on every level, look in any kindergarten in the United States of America. You want to see the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people, look at any kindergarten in any neighborhood of the American people. This is where it lies. Every person in this room, every person in this room, every person in this town, every person in America, and I believe every person in the world, wants to live their dreams. Wants to feel so much inside. They want to do the good. They want to do the beautiful. They do at some deep level. Everybody, rich, poor, I don't care who. But we in America cap people's dreams these days. And no wonder everybody's so tense, and no wonder everybody's so anxious, and no wonder our economy is not working except for this small group of people, and then instead of fixing it, they just tell us that it's doing well. That's how they handle it. Instead of fixing it, they just tell us that it's doing very, very well. So our entire sense of where our sustainability and our goodness should come from should have not only, it's so much deeper than just people and not profits. It's the democratic ideal. If you really, every generation has to decide basically between two archetypes, democracy or aristocracy. It's 1776 all over again. But if the love of the idea that all of us are equal and all of us have potential genius is just something that we have on marble walls in Washington or in parchment behind glass somewhere, it loses moral force. Every generation has to become ablaze with it. It's always the same. Just like in our Declaration of Independence, you have the most enlightened principles established ever in the founding of a country. And you also have the fact that 41 signers owned slaves. So that tension has always been with us. It's present in every generation. There are those whose hearts are ablaze with the possibility of a society in which, to the best of our ability, we remove the shackles so all beings can thrive, in the belief that that's how it's going to be good for everybody. Or you have those forces in every generation that basically take the attitude, we will not be doing that. But our narrative over time is that democracy wins out. We had slavery, but then we had abolition. We had suppression of women, but then we had the women's suffragette movement. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, but then we had the civil rights movement. I meant before we had the women's suffragette movement. And then we had the civil rights movement. Our generation is facing the same tension that other generations have faced. Assaults on our democratic freedoms in the name of financial power for simply a few people. It is no different than 1776. It is no different than slavery. It is no different than segregation. It is no different than the suppression of women. The only thing that's different is the possibility that our generation might be so propagandized that we unknowingly wimp out on doing what it takes to push back against aristocracy. A couple of issues that need us to take that moral, deep look has to do with race in America. For anyone who is on any kind of a religious path, a spiritual path, a path of recovery, a path of deep psychotherapy, one of the universal themes is that you have to take a look at your own character defects. And whether you're a Catholic and you go to confession, or you are a Jew on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement, or you are in recovery with the 12 steps and you have to take a moral inventory and a deep, honest look. America has our own national character defects. And one that's been with us from the very beginning has been race and racism. Now, I don't think that the average American is a racist. I don't at all. But I do think the average American is deeply undereducated about the history of race in the United States, particularly since the Civil War. I think many people don't realize the level of violence that continued to be perpetrated against the former slave population at the end of the Civil War. What were called the Black Code Laws, which ensured subpar economic and social and political opportunity to the former slave population, which then led into Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, lynchings, full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, so that actually, even at the end of the Civil War for the next 100 years, even though it was not the violence of slavery, which was a violence that had been in place for 2.5 centuries, that was followed by another 100 years of violence perpetrated against blacks in the American South. At the end of the Civil War, General Sherman had promised the former slaves, every family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. Because with 40 acres and a mule, former slaves would have had a chance to start life over. They were not given that opportunity. And that phase of violence post-Civil War went unchallenged until the Civil Rights Movement 100 years later. The success of the Civil Rights Movement was passage of the legislation called the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. With the passage of the Civil Rights legislation, the externalized forms of segregation were dismantled. You can't be, it's now illegal to say, a black can't be hired or can't sit at the lunch counter or whatever. And then the next year, what was so significant with the Voting Rights Act was that blacks could not be discriminated against in practices of voting. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we should all be aware that as of 2013, the John Roberts-led, very corporatist Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. As soon as they did that, voting suppression efforts began all over the country. So in many ways, when it comes to race in America, we're actually sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Voter suppression efforts aimed at people of color and disenfranchised communities means we're sliding backward. racial disparity in criminal sentencing means we're sliding backwards. Now, those 40 acres and a mule, in most cases were never given, and even when they were given, in most cases were then taken away. And as a consequence of that, the former slave population and its descendants never were able to catch up, never have been able to close the statistical gap economically between whites and blacks in America. Since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. And even though they can't make the Holocaust not have happened, those reparations have been an important part of the reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and Europe. Similarly, in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, where among the people who had been interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, all surviving prisoners were given between $20,000 and $22,000. And so I would like to submit, I think we should have a plan of reparations for slavery. I think it would be a great gift to our children and our children. You know, we all talk about small, random acts of kindness, but in many ways in our country today, it's time to do some huge, strategized acts of doing the right thing. This is what will morally repair us. We need a moral and a spiritual awakening. The last thing I'd like to mention to you for your specific, and anywhere you go, you can talk about climate change, and of course we're not fighting climate change adequately because of the recalcitrance of the oil companies, which want to make sure they're protecting their profits and so forth. But another area, when it comes to climate change, there is this massive awakening, I believe, on the part of the American people, particularly the young, where we get this. But there's another area where it's way too veiled. And that's how our new aristocracy works. It's a veiled aristocracy. And that has to do with our national defense. It was Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who warned us. He was not only president, but before that he had been the supreme Allied commander of all Allied forces during World War II. Before World War II, we didn't have a standing army. Now, I'm not suggesting we don't have a standing army now. Of course we must. And nothing that I'm saying is in any way a critique of our military. I have great respect for our military. I think we all do. The problem with our military agenda and our defense agenda is not a problem with the military. It's a problem with political leadership which too often is basing our defense agenda not on any agenda or plan for safety and peace on this planet, but only for further preparedness for war in order to increase profits from military industrial complex. So as a consequence, for instance, we will be spending $718 billion this year on military, but we keep cutting spending on those things which actually build peace. If you want peace, like I said, you can't just fight disease, you have to cultivate health. We can't just prepare for war, we need to wage peace. Even Donald Rumsfeld said that. General Mattis said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. The State Department, which as I just mentioned, the first one in this administration, ex-CEO of Exxon, it's supposed to be a humanitarian. It's supposed to be a diplomat. And the factors which build peace on earth that we know, when present, decrease violence in that community are three things, none of which will surprise you. Number one, increased economic opportunity for women. Number two, increased educational opportunity for children. And number three, the amelioration of unnecessary human suffering whenever and however possible. But that doesn't make corporate profits for anyone. When I was young, we actually had to ban the bomb movement. We're so exhausted now, we don't even talk about it. We don't even talk about the fact that we have thousands of nuclear bombs. We're just hoping, quote unquote, they're taking care of it. And you need to know, as citizens, how they're taking care of it. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders. This is not fun to look at. We have ordered 100 B-21 Raiders, and those B-21 Raiders each cost $550 million, and each one of them carry both conventional and nuclear bombs. Now, this is not a question for them. This is a question for you. Please tell me. We need an integrative politics. We need to come at this not just with this disconnected place of dollars and cents. We need to come at this from our heart. What do we need 100 planes that carry nuclear bombs for? Well, You drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's probably over for humanity for at least 200 or 300,000 years. This has nothing to do with planning for peace, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, because of a $100 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, we are doing the most immoral thing. Because of that arms sale, we know what the new Prince of Saudi Arabia is doing. He's prosecuting a war in Yemen, causing the starvation of tens of thousands of people. Many of them are children. Go online, look at these pictures. Our Secretary of State, in response to this, says, well, you know, sometimes you have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. No, you can't, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. That means you sacrifice your values.
That's right.
And that is what is happening to our country. That is what has happened. A person who has no ethics, a person who has no morals is called a sociopath. And an economic system which has no morals, which has more to do with the profit for the chemical company than whether or not that chemical in that pesticide will hurt a child's brain. This is a sociopathic economic system. And this is not something that you can just treat by fixing an issue here or fixing an issue there. Of course we should have universal health care, but we need to go more than that. We need to say more than that it's a right. We need to get how really insane it is that we don't. We need to get that this is the richest country in the world, and that we have been trained to just ask pretty please, until we realize the level of moral and psychological dysfunction that ever took us here, it'll come back around. And that's why we should have the universal health care. That's why we should cancel most of these college loans. That's why we should have free college. That's why we should increase the minimum wage. Not just because you deserve it or you have rights, but because we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to cultivate democracy in this country, to do what we can to create a society in which you get to make your dreams come true, you get to make your dreams come true, you get to make your dreams come true. You're not shackled by all these survival issues. Why? Because America will be better. So when you lose your dreams and you lose your dreams and you lose your dreams, America starts to lose its dream. And what has happened now is that fear, as we know, has been harnessed for political purposes in this country. The only way to defeat that, ladies and gentlemen, if you think that's as easy as defeating him in 20, there's nothing sophisticated about that. That is very naive, because there are so many people lined up behind him. And if all we do is white knuckle and we got to be tough enough to beat him in 20, please. They will be back in 22 and they'll be back in 24. The only way to defeat dog whistles is to drown them out with angel voices. And you can't drown them out. And you can't drown them out with angel voices by sending someone else to Washington to fix it. The president does not have a magic wand, thank God. Nor should he or she. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. I want to go to Washington and co-create with you. I want to go in Washington and try to set things right on the level of policy that you have to set things right in Exeter and in New Hampshire. All of us have to do the same work. Our government, our economy, and in too many ways our lives have swerved away from doing the right thing, from being good. We have to take a deep breath and start asking, what does it mean to be a good person? And what does it mean to be a good society? A good society, a just society. We can't just fight injustice. All this injustice would not have set in had we not stopped asking, what does it mean to be just? That's why Martin Luther King said there are two kinds of peace, negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace, he said, is where there's no, he said negative peace is where there's no outright violence, but there's underlying tension and anxiety. That's why when I wrote my book, Healing of America, in 1997, I was already talking about wealth inequality and mass incarceration and the corporatocracy, because it was already there. Everybody was talking about how good things were, and I was saying, well, doesn't that depend on what neighborhood you live in? Doesn't that depend on what part of the world you live in? If you have stage 1 cancer, your oncologist doesn't say it's only stage 1, let's just not worry about it, because it will grow. And so now we know we have this problem on our hands. But it's not midnight, it's the 11th hour, but it's not midnight yet. And even though a lot of people in the world roll their eyes about America today, and it's no joke at all that we have lost our moral authority in this world. Anybody who knows anything about American history also knows. You know, sometimes we sleep too long. Sometimes we're sort of slow to wake up. one thing about America, anybody knows who knows anything about our history, that once we do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to slam it.